Welcome back to Into the Paradox. We are creatures bound to the ground. Our bodies are defined by gravity, our fears rooted in the drop, the fall, the uncontrollable descent. Yet, for centuries, we have dreamed of leaving the Earth, defying the very force that defines us. And when we finally began to achieve that dream, when we strapped into rickety gliders, navigated pressurized cockpits, and blasted off into the void, we needed silent witnesses. We needed living proof. Today, we dive into one of humanity's most profound and necessary paradoxes of modern history, the story of the animals, the pigeons, the mice, the monkeys, and the dogs, who carried the weight of our ambitions into the skies and beyond, often paying the ultimate price for human elevation. Joining me today to unpack this history is Dr. Anastasia Volkov. Anastasia is a historian specializing in Cold War technological development and ethical research practices. Anastasia, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Peter. It's an honor to be here.
Anastasia, when we talk about animals in science, we often jump straight to Laika, the famous space dog. But the paradox, this idea of using life to test the limits of human technology, started much earlier, right there in the dawn of aviation. What were the first animals doing in the air?
That's right. Before we could even think about space, we had to figure out how to keep a wooden machine in the air. The earliest uses were incredibly practical, even mundane. Think about the Wright brothers, or earlier still, the balloonists of the 18th century. They often carried farm animals, a duck, a sheep, a rooster, not necessarily for scientific data, but simply to prove that the air at altitude wasn't poisonous. It was a litmus test for survival.
So it was less about engineering and more about overcoming superstition and fear.
Exactly. But as aviation became more complex, so did the role of the animals. By the First World War, we see the mass strategic deployment of animals, primarily pigeons. They were the original avionics system. Pigeons were essential for communication, but they weren't just messengers, were they? We were also testing equipment on them. In the interwar period, absolutely. As flight speeds increased, and particularly when we started developing parachutes, researchers needed to test deployment mechanisms. You couldn't risk a human life on an untested parachute rig, but a weighted dummy didn't provide physiological data on shock or descent stability. So, often, animals like dogs, or more commonly, monkeys and small pigs, were housed in ejection seats or specialized capsules and dropped from high altitudes. They were the first real biological stress testers.
It's a chilling thought, the utter reliance on a creature that has no context for the experiment. I imagine the records from this period are fairly sterile?
They had to be. These tests were necessarily brutal, but the data gathered was invaluable for optimizing human safety. The paradox here, Peter, is that the very animals designed to run, fly, or climb were being purposefully put into situations where their bodies would be subjected to forces they could never endure in nature, all so that we could move faster and higher. As we moved into the era of jet power and the Cold War, the challenge wasn't just staying up, it was surviving environments that were actively hostile to life: extreme altitude, extreme G-forces, and rapid decompression. How did the animal subjects change to meet these challenges?
The focus shifted entirely from flight mechanics to biological tolerance. We needed animals whose size and internal physiology mimicked humans, which is why dogs, monkeys, and later, chimpanzees became the primary test subjects.
During the development of pressurized suits and high-altitude flight in the 1940s and 50s, the US and the Soviets were both heavily using animals to test things like oxygen deprivation limits. They would place a dog or a monkey in a low-pressure chamber and gradually lower the pressure until the animal experienced hypoxia or decompression sickness.
This is when we start seeing the foundation for space medicine, even though they weren't in rockets yet.
Precisely. One crucial area was deceleration. The US Air Force used aerial rockets on rails, or sleds, to test G-forces. While Colonel John Stubb famously rode these sleds himself, many of the initial tests that proved the limits of the human body were performed exclusively by chimpanzees and pigs. They had monitoring equipment implanted to measure heart rate, brain activity, and respiration during those incredibly violent stops.
Why the chimpanzee?
The chimpanzee is physically robust, highly trainable, and shares significant genetic similarity with humans. This made their data far more relevant than a mouse or a dog for complex tasks. It's critical to note that the animals weren't just passive passengers anymore. They were trained to be active participants. They had to be able to pull levers or push buttons in response to stimuli, proving that cognitive function could be maintained under extreme G-loads.
It makes the eventual leap to space almost inevitable. They had proven, via these animals, that a body could endure the violence of a launch and still be capable of rational thought. Let's move to the ultimate test, leaving the planet. In the 1950s, the USSR launched the world's most famous animal martyr, Laika. As a historian, what is the true legacy of Laika beyond the tragedy?
Laika is arguably the most recognizable symbol of this ethical paradox. She was a stray dog chosen because they believed strays were hardier and accustomed to severe conditions. She was launched in 1957 aboard Sputnik 2. The world knew she was sent up with no recovery plan. She was guaranteed to die.
And scientifically, what did she prove?
Laika proved the biological possibility of survival through the launch phase and confirmed that the living organism could endure the transition to weightlessness. The initial Soviet reports claimed she survived for several days, but we now know she died within a few hours from overheating and panic, a failure of engineering, not biology. Her death was a powerful global ethical debate, forcing people to confront the cost of the space race.
If Laika proved survival was possible, who proved that performance was feasible? That would be Ham, the chimpanzee. Launched by the US in 1961, Ham was a genuine astronaut trainee. He was taught to respond to light sequences by pulling levers. His flight was suborbital, but he experienced the full launch, weightlessness, and re-entry process. Crucially, he executed his tasks mid-flight. So Ham proved that not only could you survive space, but you could work in space.
Yes, and this was the final biological barrier before Gagarin's flight later that year. Ham proved that the systems, life support, pressure, and the controls worked well enough for a functioning organism to survive and operate machinery. Unlike Laika, Ham was recovered successfully, proving the viability of re-entry and splashdown systems for living cargo. He lived a long life afterward in zoos, a quiet retiree of the space race.
The sheer number of animals involved, mice, frogs, spiders, everything that followed, it's staggering. Do we have a good estimate of how many non-human lives were sacrificed or utilized in the pursuit of aviation and space travel?
It is difficult to quantify precisely, especially in the early aviation era, but we are certainly talking about thousands of animals worldwide. When you factor in the sheer volume of test animals used in vacuum chambers, G-sleds, and high-altitude balloon tests leading up to the space race, the number is overwhelming. Every single successful human flight, from the Wright Flyer to the moon landing, was built upon the biological data collected from creatures who never signed up for the mission.
Anastasia, as we look back, we celebrate the human pioneers, but the ethical shadow cast by these animal pioneers remains. How should we, as a society, process the debt owed to these creatures?
It's a debt of acknowledgement. We need to remember them not as footnotes, but as essential, living components of our technological history. Their suffering provided the margins of safety that allowed human space exploration to succeed relatively quickly. The paradox, the central contradiction, is that we use the most vulnerable among us to achieve the most ambitious technological feat imaginable, transcending our own terrestrial vulnerability. It's a profound testament to the cost of human progress.
Dr. Anastasia Volkov, thank you for bringing this crucial and often overlooked history into the light. Your insights into the scientific necessity versus the moral ambiguity of these tests are deeply appreciated.
Thank you, Peter. It was a pleasure.
That was Dr. Anastasia Volkov, historian and researcher. The silent pioneers of the sky and the cosmos allowed us to define the limits of human endurance. They asked no questions, demanded no fame, and received little glory. But every window we look out of in an airplane, every picture we see from orbit, it exists because a pigeon flew, a dog orbited, and a chimpanzee pulled the lever. Thank you for joining me on Into the Paradox. We'll return next week to explore another contradiction at the heart of the human story.